It's my boy! It's my boy!
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to mourn both the deaths of my YouTube comment section and also your kindergarten color theory lessons. A moment of silence, if you will. Thank you. You may go. A few weeks ago, I made a couple of short form videos here on YouTube about the nature of color theory and what the actual primary colors are. And in these videos, I explained why red is not a primary color. Those videos kind of blew up and there was a lot of different comments on them. And some of them were super awesome and supportive and really, really kind, nice comments. And some others So, I wanted to make this video to clear some things up about the primary colors, some myths about them, and what the actual primary colors are, and why, and what that means, and why red isn't a primary color. At least in subtractive color series, color systems. I can talk. Okay. First things first, in order to break down misconceptions about what a primary color is, we have to know what a primary color is. We have to know the definition of a primary color. When you look up primary color, you get this. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a primary color is any of a group of colors from which all other colors can be obtained by mixing. Okay, so that's sort of helpful. So by that definition, if we find any random color in the world around us, theoretically, you should be able to mix it using only a combination of those primary colors, right? That makes sense. In addition, I think it would be a fair deduction to make that because they're primary colors, they cannot be mixed using other colors. For instance, you can't mix orange and green and get yellow. It's not a thing. People have claimed it in my comments, but you can't do it. If you've ever tried it, it's not a thing. This is where we start to run into some tricky issues with red. So let's dispel some myths about this so-called primary color. Because guess what? Red is a lie. Okay, first myth. Vivid purples can be made by mixing red and blue together. Let's visualize the primary colors. When you visualize a primary red, you probably think of a certain hue. And that hue would probably be something like this or this. Now, a primary blue is trickier, but most people would probably picture something like this. Let's say you're trying to mix a really beautiful, vibrant, bright purple. So to make a purple, you take your primary red and your primary blue and maybe a little bit of white if you wanted more of a pastel or a lighter shade, and you mix everything together, you get all the proportions right, and you get gray. That's not right, obviously. Maybe we're just doing it with the wrong red. So let's try all of the pigments that I have that are labeled as red. Now, as a quick aside, the way that we find out which colors are actually red is by looking at the back of the tube and looking at the pigment index number and shade. With the back of a oil paint tube, for instance, you'll look on the back and you'll see something like PR118, and it stands for pigment rather than dye. Red, which is the general color, and then you'll have like the number that represents what that specific hue of the color is, or what that like color family is. So all those pigments that have been officially classified as red by the International Color Index are going to have the letters PR on the back if they are a high enough quality of paint. Oh, I'm sorry, what was the Color Index International, you ask?
Well, the Color Index International was first created in 1925 and is a database of pigments and dyes published by the Society of Dyists and Colorists and the American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists. Colorants are given many different proprietary and generic names, but the Color Index International provides a standardized system used by manufacturers and consumers all over the world that can be a hugely informative tool for artists.
So essentially, the International Color Index is the system by which professionals and businesses classify what certain colors are, if that makes sense. So there's an internationally recognized, oh, this is a shade of red, this is a shade of violet, this is a shade of green, etc., etc., etc. Cool. So let's gather all those reds up that I have and see if we can fix this. At this point, These are all of the reds that I have in my collection as a professional artist. Obviously, there are a lot more reds out there, but this is a pretty good spread of warm, medium, and cool-toned reds, so it should work nicely for our little experiment. And just for fun, let's try both the traditional primary blue, I'm using an ultramarine here, as well as a color closer to the cyan of the primary printing colors, CMYK. So let's try that again. And as we mix all of these colors together to try and get the perfect purple, we get, well, it sort of worked. So some of them, especially the permanent alizarin crimson, did a better job at mixing reds, but they all still turned out a bit dark and sad looking, and grew desaturated and muddy when white was added to try and brighten them up. Obviously, something isn't quite right here. If red is a primary color, why the heck can't we make a good saturated purple using red? So what's the answer to this mystery, you ask? It's that red is a fraud, an imposter, a sham. This whole time our kindergarten teachers have been indoctrinating us into the lie of the century, that red is a primary color, when in fact it is not. And if red isn't a primary color, what the heck is? Suddenly, out of the corner of our eye, there comes, like a shining beacon, the truth. Magenta. What, Becca, you say? That's impossible. Magenta is made by mixing red and blue together. And to this I say nay. Once again, you have been lied to. If you don't believe me, try it. Try and take a pure red, something that says PR on the back of the tube, and try and mix a beautiful, vibrant magenta. Try it. I'm waiting. Clip this video. Show me. The fact of the matter is that pigments don't often work like that. A lot of paint pigments come from natural sources or chemical synthesis, not just mixing colors together. There isn't like a team of scientists or artists in the back taking different proportions of red, blue, and yellow and mixing them into different color combinations and then putting them in tubes. That's not really how paint colors work. For instance, the color phthalo green is made from chlorinated copper, or phthalocyanine PG7. Although there's variation in the specific color of the pigment used to create the paint, which can allow for some variety, and there's different chemical syntheses or processes that they use, that's one singular substance. They're not taking a blue pigment and a yellow pigment and mixing it together to create a lot of these green pigments that we see in our paints. And obviously, I'm not saying that you're never going to get a green tone of paint that isn't yellow and blue mixed together. I'm just saying that that's how a lot of paint tones work, is that because they come from natural sources or from chemical synthesis, they're already a pure color. They haven't been mixed to make that color. Really, all I'm getting at is that the process of making specific colors and pigments is a lot more complex than we give it credit for. So that brings us back to the hero of the hour, Quinacridone magenta. The real primary color, the one that should have the seat of honor, the crown of truth, the laurels of glory, the big gulp of sincerity, it's the real one, I promise. So why? Quinacridone magenta is a synthetic organic pigment, which means that it's not naturally derived from a specific plant or mineral. Its original ingredients include various chemical compounds that are used in the synthesis process of the color. The pigment is chemically synthesized by forming and modifying the quinacridone compound through carefully controlled chemical reactions and treatments. If you've ever seen like Nile Red or Nile Blue on YouTube, or any of the other awesome chemistry channels on here, think like that. So basically, you take a bunch of different like powdery substances. I am not a chemist. I'm not a chemist. Keep that in mind. But you take a bunch of these different chemical compounds. A lot of them are literally white powders, or I think there's like an off-white / yellowish clear liquid, and you combine them together, and through science and chemical reactions, it becomes quinacridone. But anyway, they combine all of these different compounds, and then that substance is then further processed to eventually produce the specific shade of quinacridone magenta. The resulting pigment is known for its brightness, its light fastness, and its durable color, which makes it a really popular choice for both artists and for print cartridges.
Classically, the parent is prepared from the 2.5 dianolide of tetrafallic acid. Condensation of succinose-succinate esters with aniline followed by cyclization affords dihydroquinacridone, which are readily dehydrated. The latter is oxidized to quinacridone. Derivatives of quinacridone can be readily obtained by employing substitute anilines. Linear cis-quinacridones can be prepared from isophthalic acid.
Okay, so let's review. We can obviously make a better purple with a quinacridone magenta than we can with a red. And quinacridone magenta is a pure pigment. It's not mixed, and you can't mix it using red and blue. And here's the thing, you can use it to mix a beautiful, vibrant, traditional red. It sounds like you shouldn't be able to, but you can. So what naturally follows is that if you can't mix magenta with red, but you can mix red with magenta, then clearly red isn't a primary color, magenta is. And honestly, this isn't going to be a huge surprise to a lot of people. If you've ever worked with printed media, you know that a printer's color cartridges for their ink are CMYK. They're not RYBK. So the real question is, why don't we just rename the primary red? Why don't we just call magenta another shade of red? A lot of people were saying, well, that's just a shade of red. It's the same thing. It's just a pinkish red. It's just a cool toned red. That's all this magenta is. Well, this guy named John Muir-Laws, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he has an awesome quote about this in his article that's called Reinventing the Wheel.
So why not just call magenta a shade of red and cyan a shade of blue? Those names are already used as the primary colors for light. The primaries for pigments must be distinct to differentiate them from red and blue. Second, we have a clear idea of a hue in our head when we say red. Color names become less useful when they're used to describe a larger arc of color across the color wheel. The word blue already has this problem. It's used on the tubes of so many colors of paint that it has lost its specificity. To preserve the meaning of blue, use it to describe the primary color of light, or the consequence of mixing cyan and magenta pigments. It's easier for us all to envision the same color when we say cyan. Just as it would be confusing to describe red as an orangish violet, describing cyan as a greenish shade of blue makes no sense. Call cyan cyan. Name the color that you mean. Stop describing magenta as an off color of red. Instead, call magenta magenta. It is red that is a yellowish magenta.
Although I personally wouldn't go as far as to call red a yellowish magenta, I do think that it's important to keep in mind the fact that there's a lot of misconceptions about color and color theory out there. So to finish off this concept, I decided to make two separate color wheels. One with the traditional red, yellow, and blue, and the other with cyan, magenta, and yellow, or the closest that I could find in oil paint colors. And here those are. In my opinion, the CMY color wheel definitely gave a brighter and more versatile range of colors. It goes without saying, but you can always continue to mix colors to be less bright and punchy, but you can't really mix a color to be brighter than it is in its purest form, like the purples that we mixed earlier in the video. And so, in conclusion, red is not a primary color. Everything is a lie. Magenta is superior. That's it. That's all I have.